Go for it.
All right, man. So we are going to be in February 7, 1973, which is when it's now this one is Iggy and the Stooges, so different than the Stooges, which was the first two, but on the initial run of the Stooges, in other words, the 70s run of the Stooges, this is going to be the third and final album. This album includes a different lineup in many different ways from the earlier Stooges album. Now, you've still got Iggy Pop up front, now going by Iggy Pop instead of Iggy Stooge, so that's one thing to know. The other big thing is that James Williamson is on this album, and he was not on the first two. And you probably noticed, guys, as you listen to this album, the guitar sounds a little bit different on this album than it did in the first two. Mm-hmm. And Mr. Williamson, we're going to talk about him quite a bit. He co-wrote 8 of the songs with Iggy Pop on this album. So, and the album is 8 songs. And so he was a co-writer on each song. Ron Ashton and
Wait,
Scott.
John, do you have the music and the numbers and all that stuff?
I do,
the montage?
Matt. I do.
Let's do that, because I know you have to do that up front.
This is going to be a shitty cut on YouTube. So YouTube folks.
No, I don't. It sounds so good. Don't worry.
I have to just go edit to blank on this along the way. You know what I mean? Because I can't play the music. So Josh just wedged it in at the beginning here, and I'll go backwards. So about a minute and a half ago, post edit right there, you would have heard "Penetration" by the Stooges, and back then, now you're going to hear "Give Me Danger." And so you heard that a minute and a half ago. So that was real smooth, wasn't it, guys? We're as well polished the machine as the edits were for this album, which we're going to talk about in quite a bit. So, but go ahead, guys. I heard you wanted to chime in there.
Well, I got the numbers here, too.
The numbers, yep.
The numbers. So this is number 72 on Best Ever Albums in the 1970s, number 8 in 1973. Overall rank of 285 of all time, and it did not make Rolling Stone's top 500 list. It is the Stooges' second highest ranked album on Best Ever Albums, behind Funhouse, but ahead of the self-titled debut album, The Stooges.
Well, thank you, Matt, for cleaning that up a little bit, because my opening was a little more unwieldy than Iggy's personal life around this time. So I'm going to try to clean it up a little bit here, which was something that Iggy himself did in 1975 with a couple stays in some neuropsychiatric units and stuff like that. But around this time, Iggy was still highly substance abuse using. But going back to kind of what I talked about before, James Williamson is now on this album. The original plan on this album was for Iggy and James Williamson to go to England, which they did, and record a bunch of songs, basically with the Iggy and the Stooges name. They got there, they tried out some session players and some rhythm folks with bassists and drummers, and it kind of just didn't work out quite a bit. So Williamson kind of said, hey, you know what? Let's bring back Ron Ashton and Scott Ashton, who were in the group before. However, if you may remember, Ron Ashton was the lead guitarist the initial go-around. Well, he cannot be the lead guitarist this time around, so he actually agreed to switch to the electric bass for this album, and in almost every accounting of it, the terms reluctantly was described on this one. So he was the reluctant electric bassist, and then Scott Ashton was the drummer again. And so you've got James Williamson on his first album, and then Iggy and the two Ashtons before.
And so, John, before James Williamson hasn't come up before in the Iggy Pop and Stooges bio, has it?
No, he has not come up yet,
Okay.
but he is... I guess this is going to be a little bit different bio, guys, because the meat and bones of it, the origin story, is just third album. It took about 2 years to complete. It was originally basically going to be a Iggy and James Williamson project together. The Ashtons come in and they do it as basically a band approach, okay, in this one. So that's kind of how it goes about. During this time, Iggy's in England. He's just a mess with substances and, crazy behavior. Bowie.
Yeah, I was just going to say he's with Bowie, right? He
isn't with him at this point. So he's around England, and Bowie was always a huge Stooges fan, and Bowie kind of looked at it as his mission to kind of he loved the Stooges and wanted to save them and stuff like that. But I'm going to save Bowie for a little bit, because how he gets interjected into this album is interesting, because for the most part he was just trying to keep Iggy Pop sober and kind of on the rails a little bit, which is kind of funny when you think about it. But remember, this is like 72. Iggy Pop and Bowie, and remember, Bowie doesn't really pick up the major habits, right, until the Ziggy Stardust tour around the Aladdin Sane time, right, which is 73. So while he may be he's not using at that level that would escalate in the mid-70s. Matt, what you might be thinking about is when Bowie produced Iggy Pop's comeback solo albums, but that's not going to be until he's in Berlin with Brian Eno in the later 70s, and Iggy Pop's there as well after he's cleaned up. So that's going to be when he does like The Idiot and Lust for Life and stuff like that. So this is still when he's rooted in the Stooges. But, the Stooges' first two albums were not super well received and didn't sell very well, nor did this album. So all three in their time were... Some critics loved it. A lot of critics hated the first couple. This one got a little bit better critical reviews. But this album is really well known for three things. Number one, Williamson's guitar playing is super lauded. I mean, there's a who's who of people that said they were influenced by his guitar playing on this. If you want to kind of have like a quick rundown, Steve Jones of the Sex Pistols is quoted in many venues as saying he basically learned how to play the guitar when, the Sex Pistols were learning how to play their instruments. He learned it by doing speed and listening to this album. Johnny Marr has said this is, if not his favorite guitar album, one of his biggest, influences from the Smiths. Thurston Moore of Sonic Youth, I think his quote was, "This one like ripped my head off when I listened to it originally. It was incredible." John Frusciante of the Chili Peppers said it was a hugely seminal album for him. Kurt Cobain, very famously, has often referred to this as one of, if not his favorite albums. Henry Rollins, who I think the Stooges he references as his favorite band all time, he said this is his second favorite album. He loves the guitar playing. I can keep going. Like CeeLo Green, of all people, said that this may be his favorite rock album ever, and he's a producer. So there's just a who's who of people that were influenced. It's like my CD collection from my youth. Basically, all of them were influenced by this album. So Williamson's guitar playing, which he has a unique style, which we'll talk about a little bit, but it's highly influential. The second thing about this is this album is considered both one of the earliest examples, along with the earlier Stooges albums and a couple others, of like what punk music would sound like in the 70s, and also a little bit of like what heavy metal would sound like. Now, not heavy metal in the soaring guitars, but heavy metal in terms of the cacophony of sound and the way Iggy Pop's like vocals are. It's highly influential in both punk and metal circles, this album. It's pretty much loved on those fronts, so it's considered both proto-punk and proto-metal in many ways. During its time, it was referred to as a heavy metal album all the time, which is funny because the definition of heavy metal has changed, but you kind of can get it, especially if you're like listening to like thrash metal and stuff. Like if you speed up thrash metal, if you speed up the Stooges album, right, and you can kind of get to what thrash metal sounds like if you listen carefully. So that would be the second thing about this album. And number three is, and we're going to talk about this a little bit, the constant on this album is the different productions. The original one, and boy, there's a story with it, was done by David Bowie, and I guess the best way to describe it is Iggy Pop was originally going to produce this album, okay? And he was working with an engineer, but he was doing it on his own. There's 1,000 different apocryphal stories about this, but Iggy Pop's story, and I'm going to go with his, is that when he recorded himself on one track, and then the instrumentation on another track. So it was kind of garbled into two different parts on tapes. Now, Bowie says that he got it as a bunch of individual tapes, like each of the parts, like the drums, the bass, the guitar, the vocals, and stuff like that. And pretty much everybody agrees, though, that like it was a mess and that the recording of it got away from Iggy Pop. Now, bootlegs were released over the years of like Iggy Pop's original mixes, which is not to be confused with the mixes he does in 1997. So let me start by saying that, because that's a whole nother thing. But Bowie comes in, he's asked by the sound engineer, Tony DeFries, right, who we've talked about with Bowie, he basically tells him that he wants Bowie to remix the album, okay? Because the original one was done at RG Jones Studios in Wimbledon, England. The sound engineer was Keith Harwood, and there was another engineer, Jerry Kitchingham, and it was pretty much just a mess. And so Bowie comes in, and so Bowie kind of says, he has his take. I'm going to actually read to you, if you guys will humor me, the quotes that most often come up, because the first is Iggy Pop and the second is David Bowie. And it's impossible to talk about this album without talking about the mixes, because it gets talked about in almost the first couple sentences of any review you ever read of this album. So here's Iggy Pop's description on the production. To the best of my recollection, it was done in a day. I don't think it was 2 days. On a very, very old board. I mean, this board was old. An Elvis type of board. Old tech, low tech, in a poorly lit, cheap old studio with very little time. To David's credit, he listened with his ear to each thing and talked it out with me. I gave him what I thought it should have. He put it in his perspective, added some touches. He's always liked the recent technology, so there was something called a time cube you could feed a signal into. It looked like a bong, a big plastic tube with a couple of bends in it, and when the sound came in at either end, it sort of shot at you like an echo effect. He used that on the guitar in Gimme Danger, a beautiful guitar echo overlord that's absolutely beautiful, and on the drums in Your Pretty Face Is Gonna Go to Hell. His concept for production was, you're so primitive, your drummer should sound like he's beating a log. It's not a bad job that he did. I'm proud of this eccentric, odd little album that came out. And here's Bowie's take. This was the most absurd situation I encountered when I was recording the first time I worked with Iggy Pop. He wanted me to mix raw power, so he brought the 24-track tape in, and he put it up. He had the band on one track, lead guitar on another, and him on the third. Out of 24 tracks, there were just 3 tracks that were used. He said, see what you can do with this. I said, Jim, there's nothing to mix. So we just pushed the vocals up and down a lot. On at least 4 or 5 of the songs, that was the situation, including Search and Destroy. That's got such a peculiar sound because all we did was occasionally bring the lead guitar up and take it out. So basically, Bowie's recollection is that his production is basically him just moving the guitar sound up on a song and the vocals up on others. And the rest was sort of the garbled stuff. This becomes... So... There are some that will swear by Bowie's take because it's definitely considered to be more of almost a lo-fi approach to it, and definitely the sound is pushed in the back for sure. Okay. So when when Iggy Pop remixes it in 1997, which he does because they say, we want to remaster this. And Iggy Pop's like, well, I don't know if I want to remaster it. And he says he quickly realized that unless he remastered himself, they were going to remaster it. So he trusted himself more than whoever they were going to bring in. So he brought it in, and he definitely did not push the stuff in the back. He pushed it to the front, which I think Josh did listen to the second version, right?
Yes.
And so it's there. And some people love that version of it, and other people say it's just impossible to listen to because it's so loud. And it is. It's one of the loudest recordings ever in the history of CDs in terms of how he recorded it. And if you were to put it on a studio, because I did, it does sound really freaking loud. So it's pretty much the polar the only album I can think of, guys, that we did that was so different in different things was that Beach Boys Today album in the mono in the studio. And I'm by no means an audiophile, but that was the only one where I was like, boy, that sounds really different. This one, though, is like a totally different album when you listen to it. Now, the interesting thing is when it went on vinyl later, in 2011, they did another remix of it that kind of is considered to be the best of both worlds between it. And I can vouch for having heard all 3 of them, that I would argue that the 2011 one is probably how the album should sound. It's aggressive and primal like the Iggy Pop mix, but it's cleaner in terms of the pure sound like the Bowie album was. So it kind of meets it in the middle. But there's constant descriptions of people who will vouch for any of the different versions of the album. Now, the band says they prefer Bowie's version of it, the Ashtons and James Williamson. But that was when they were comparing it to Iggy's version of it. The 2011 album is pretty much, I think, the best one. And the band members have had their ups and downs, by the way. And James Williamson also had his ups and downs with Bowie. So there's a lot of read the context for everything, because I think sometimes people don't necessarily want to give all their credit and stuff like that. But Yeah, it's just, I would say if you're going to listen to this album, you almost have to listen to all three versions of it. The Bowie version, the 2007 version by Iggy Pop, both of those are on Spotify if you're going that way, and Apple Music. And then there's the 2011 vinyl, which you can find on YouTube, that some people have put it. And there's also a cottage industry of people mixing the album themselves. But when they're doing it, they're mostly doing it off of the 2011 version and making tweaks. So be careful when you're looking for it, because if you want the original, you have to go for the Bowie mix. The Iggy mix, you could either have the old school ones, right, that were demos that will sound like it, the 97 one, which will sound extremely loud, and then there's the 2011, vinyl remaster, and then some people take that and then call it their own mix, right, on the 2011. So it is all over the place in terms of how this album is supposed to sound. But we're going to be talking about the Bowie version of this, but I will throw in some talk about the other versions as well. Okay, praise and non-praise for this album was available for both. Some people thought that it was them at their best and that Bowie's production sort of tempered the rawness of the Stooges, but in a good way, and streamlined them a little bit. And then there were other folks that pretty much said that they thought that it kind of took a little bit of the teeth out of the Stooges versions of their earlier albums, because it does sound different than it. It's, with that being said, though, it's a highly influential album. It often ranks high on the lists of critics, even though it wasn't on this version of the Rolling Stone. It does perform well on like Pitchfork and Consequence of Sound and Mojo, like those different music blogs. Stereo Gum, they all have this album very high up, and certainly musicians freaking love this album, including, I said a bunch, Matt, but I did not mention that Motley Crue founder Nikki Sixx also said this is one of his favorite albums of all time, which I know
sounds
is
about right.
Near and dear to your heart. Songs on this album have been covered all over the place, probably some that you guys know. Spaghetti Incident, Guns N' Roses covered Raw Power on that. Ewan McGregor did Gimme Danger and Velvet Goldmine, which I knew before I even looked this up. I don't know how well you know that movie, Josh, but
yeah, I'm a fan of that.
Yeah, and there's some other one. Def Leppard did a cover of Search and Destroy, which I haven't heard, but I'm sure Matt probably did at some point without even realizing it with his Def Leppard love. So
if I did, I don't recall.
Yeah, so I'm sorry to kind of meander through that, because this album is, I mean, unfortunately, at this point, Iggy's kind of the same Iggy he was before. You know what I mean? He's, courting controversy, but it's largely sort of, he was on track to the old slow suicide by drugs, but was able to get pulled out of it, which is a real success story, especially if you see Iggy nowadays, because he's still one of the best interviews and highly erudite and just, very funny and witty and different stuff. I saw him induct the Nine Inch Nails into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and he was fantastic in that in 2020 class. Yeah, but enough about me talking. Let's kind of get some feedback. Maybe Josh, let's start with you. What were your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, so I listened to the Bowie mix first. I really like this album. I think it's probably the best, my favorite of the three Stooges albums. I feel like it still has that raw power. I don't see how people think that there's like, they've lost their teeth or whatever the expression is in this, because I think it's just as edgy and raw as the first two albums. The Bowie mix does sound much more lo-fi, and when I switched to the Iggy Pop mix, it's almost like night and day. It's like the lo-fi, it sounds like you're in like a tunnel or like underwater, and then when you switch to the other one, it's much louder and it kind of blows you back, and it's fun switching back and forth between them on Spotify sometimes in mid-song to see how they sound different. But I think, gosh, I've listened to this album many times before prepping for this, and it's like almost the epitome of punk in a way, because it's so basic on some level, but what they're singing about, what he's singing about, was such like ferocity, and then the way that they add little things to each song that make it just completely unique. Like in Penetration, when they add the little ting at the end where it goes dee nee 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 at the song, it just sticks in your head, and it makes
That's what I actually picked for the montage. You'll hear it quite a bit in the montage. Yep. Mm-hmm.
It makes it totally memorable for some reason, and separates it from like a good song to like a very good song. And the other thing is that, well, let's go with what Matt has to say so I can think about what else.
So I only listened to the Iggy Pop version, and so I don't know about I mean, I saw that there was the Bowie one up there, but if you look on, I didn't listen to that one because it fell under the Super Deluxe version, and I try not to listen to the Super Deluxe because they just have way more songs than I'm going to listen to. So I have no idea. I mean, I'm just listening to this, and I can vouch that it is very loud, and I mean, it's the title of the album is as apropos as we've covered so far. I mean, this is a raw album. Like this is just stripped down. There's not a whole lot of gimmicks going on. This is just a loud punk. This is like and garage band. John, you were mentioning metal. I'm here. This is like garage rock. You know, I'm sure that people like Jack White, White Stripes, and they're from Detroit as well. Would love something like this. Just kind of like a very stripped down, heavy, loud, angry. Like just this is punk, right? This is as punk as this is. Probably more so than the other two that we've covered because even then you had that. With the first album had that really like that slow long tune that was kind of like somewhat psychedelic, right? Like the second album, Funhouse, there's like a lot of free jazz stuff kind of going on, so they were kind of experimenting. That stuff's all gone here. This is just guitars, drums, a couple of there, like Josh mentioned, there was that the little ding thing, and there's I think there's a little acoustic guitar, like "Gimme Danger" is one of my favorite songs on that. That had a really interesting acoustic guitar part in the background, that kind of the little bit more melodic stuff. So aside from those two songs, which kind of threw in a little bit of a curveball, not a big one, but a little bit of one, the rest of this is just in your face, like kick-ass, rock and roll. The videos and pictures that I've seen of Iggy Pop, cutting himself with a bottle, and like stage diving and like, just kind of going nuts.
Well, the cover is perfect, isn't it? It looked like him in peak Iggy Pop form. That sinewy, and
this is just this is the music that you would imagine him playing while doing all of those things. So I liked it. This is generally not something that I go to like to this degree, but it's great to hear this in context of the other stuff that we're covering, because again, that we've mentioned before with the Stooges, nobody sounded like this. This is just like this is different. And I know we kind of mentioned a little bit about the New York Dolls, which I think we might talk about a little bit later at some point, but this is these guys are forerunners if there ever was one in rock and roll, and it's great. It's heavy. It's not something I think I would want to listen to at any time. I think this is a little bit of a mood album. Like there's times where I would feel more, ready or willing to listen to this than others. Of course, first thing in the morning is a little bit hard. I don't think I would do that with this album. But
I totally disagree on that.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, I mean, maybe some mornings, Sean. I don't know, but generally speaking, I'm not grabbing towards like, let me get the loudest thing I can think of for first thing in the morning. But having said that, it's still great. And it might be my favorite. It might be the most consistent, I think. Yeah. I think it's probably more consistent than the other two. I was thinking before this that I couldn't really tell which one I liked the best, but it might be this one just because of that. It's got a little bit more consistency from top to bottom. I can't really think of any weak tracks on here, whereas the other two I probably could. So, yeah, I'll go ahead and say that now, that this is my favorite of the ones that we covered. So there you go. Thumbs up.
You're right that it is like faster and more aggressive than the other two. I feel like sometimes the first two kind of took their time, and he had that like menacing vibe more, like behind in the shadows type of thing sometimes, like lurking, and on this he's out front, like literally.
And it's interesting that this is the one I listened to was remixed in 1997, because it's almost like the production with the Iggy Pop version. If you were just to play these three albums and say which one was first, I probably would say this one, based on that production, because that just seems, what I mean? Like, not necessarily with the sound, what they're doing, years aside, because it's probably less believable that this would come out in 1969, right, than the first album did. But as far as the the low technology that the limited technology that they had, as described by John in those quotes, this definitely stands out as being a more primitive sound.
Okay, so here's where I got to jump in, because it's hugely important to realize that these albums don't sound like each other, because Matt was covering the Iggy Pop version, right? Which was not recorded on like lo-fi stuff, right? It was recorded on 1997 equipment. Josh,
but it still sounds
well.
That primitive
the Stooges
sound,
are only gonna the Stooges are only gonna sound so. And Josh listened for most of the times to the Bowie mix, and so here's kind of my take on it. The Bowie mix is infuriating. It's like an even better version of what I was complaining about. A version in terms of an example of what I was complaining about with Marvin Gaye. That you've got these awesome songs and this awesome energy and vibe, and the production just hampers it. And if the David Bowie version feels like they're playing with like a lid over top of them, and you can hear that there's this ridiculously good album, but it's got a lid over top of it. And then like the Iggy Pop version takes the lid off entirely, but basically puts them in a room that amplifies the sound by like 100 to the point where it's almost too loud. And then the vinyl, I can't stress enough, the vinyl in 2011, when you listen to that, perfect. It's like that's what the album's supposed to be.
It's the Goldilocks album.
It's the perfect mix. Now, I way prefer the Iggy Pop version than the Bowie mix, but the vinyl mix is the best. And when you listen to the vinyl mix, and I would even say the Iggy Pop mix, this is a freaking incredible album. I wouldn't say it's less aggressive than the other ones or more aggressive, because I mean, any album that has like I Want to Be Your Dog and stuff, you know what I mean, can only be so non-aggressive, right? I mean, that's just an in-your-face song and stuff like that. No Fun is another, that we talked about in the deeper cuts and stuff. But this one is that there's 3 lyrical themes on this. There's violence, there's sex, and there is like nihilistic tendencies on this one, and I'd throw drugs in there as well, but they're not as explicitly talked about. But I mean, it's like a visceral version of it. Like Penetration is about what you'd think it would be about. Gimme Danger is about a violent situation. Search and Destroy is like a nihilistic anthem. Death Trip, not hard to figure out what these songs are about. And they sound nihilistic and they sound dangerous, which is something that a lot of bands go for. But outside of maybe the Stones at times, I don't know if there's any band that we've covered that sounds more dangerous in the early 70s than this band. They're just, they live on the edge, and you can tell that they are living the same way that their music sounds, because they were living like a sort of a nihilistic lifestyle, you know what I mean, like hedonistic, nihilistic, drug informed, however you want to call it. But I think the thing that really stands out is like when Iggy Pop sings about like sex, for example, he's not singing about it in any way that's sort of like loving, romantic, or even like euphemistic or detached. I mean, he's singing as if he's imagining or even doing the sex right in front of you, which is that visceral, sound. Like the music sounds like it, the way he phrases his words and different stuff, You can tell the guitar was built to sound violent in songs like Gimme Danger, and to sound angry, like Your Pretty Face Is Gonna Go to Hell, which is like a real, you could say breakup song, you can say hate F song, there's a whole bunch of different ways you can read that, right? Death Trip is the 6 minute and 7 second, race down the toilet, you know what I mean, in terms of what it sounds like. It just sounds, I think maybe, Matt, that's why you say it's a mood thing for you, but I can't relate to necessarily this nihilistic viewpoint, but it's like from a voyeuristic standpoint, Iggy Pop's as interesting a guy to embody him from a voyeuristic standpoint as any artist, I think, whether it be the Stooges stuff or his solo work, because you're kind of getting to like base level instincts. But the guitar is great. I can see why it referenced, influenced so many different folks over the years, because it doesn't have jangle like some of the guitars we talked about, but it's got some of the same guitar lines that you can see somebody takes, and if you take some of this and you mix it with the Byrds, right, you kind of get some of those jangle lines. You can see how you speed it up and you get thrash. You can see how you make it heavy and you get that thudding noise rock of like Sonic Youth or the Melvins and bands like, that take it up that way. Helmet is another band I heard, taking it and sludging up their riffs. You just see that this was the father of so many different places, like spare punk rock, certainly like the Sex Pistols and the Ramones and stuff. The like late 70s, like harder punk, like, and metal, if we're going metal, we're talking like Venom, and bands like that. It's the father of stuff like that. Sludge rock that we were talking about, which I mentioned, like the Melvins, but even like Dinosaur Jr. and stuff, like heavier guitar-driven rock. You could just see so many through lines of where this went, and I think that's the brilliance of the Stooges. And it's just remarkable to me that this band existed from 1969 to 1973, because they're so highly influential. It still sounds vital even now. It sounds vital certainly and forms almost anything from the late 70s and the 80s and early 90s. And it's fascinating to think that if you just went up to people, even people who loved music, who are of a certain age, the Stooges just floated through this era with almost no one paying attention to them besides like David Bowie, the Velvet Underground members, and maybe rock critics. And that was about the people locally in Detroit and a few, and like they were selling a remarkably low amount of albums. And, even if you talk to people now in their 60s and 70s, Iggy Pop's and the Stooges are like a curiosity. It's like, oh, well, they weren't as big as like Zeppelin, right? Or Floyd or, the Eagles, all these different people we talked about, they're all there and they just existed, but their influences, it's like, they're like the Velvet Underground. You know what I mean? They existed 10 years ahead of their time, and yet they have outlasted almost anybody else in terms of their sonic blueprint. So strong recommend for me on the Iggy Pop remix and the vinyl one in particular that I would definitely tell you to seek out. The Bowie remix, it's still a great album, and it wasn't anything Bowie did wrong. It was just with the tools of the time, right? That's probably about as well as you could do. He just decided to go lo-fi with it so it didn't sound like it was going to blow your stereo out. Which, can you imagine what it sounded like in 97 with stuff? I can only imagine it would have sounded probably horrific in 72. So I totally get why he made that choice, but it's not as good an album as the later ones,
Yeah, the other thing I would say, like kind of what differentiates this a little bit more from the other two for me is the speed of some of these songs, because even though you talk about something like No Fun, from the first album or I Want to Be Your Dog, like, I don't know, to me this, like the Search and Destroy is a great example. It just opens up with like a frantic guitar part that's almost like it's going faster than the drum beat. He's just like freewheeling this guitar part. And it's like, so that pace, as we had kind of talked about before, the difference between metal and hard rock, metal's more of a faster pace. And this album, there's several songs in here that have that more urgency, that more, that energy, that maybe the other two albums don't have as much.
Like Down on the Street and Funhouse showed a little bit of what this sound was going to be like. They were giving you little teases of it in the first
but
two albums.
This is more going all in.
Absolutely.
Perhaps, yeah.
And you still get you still get his kind of songwriting style where there's like repetition, and he kind of lulls you into this like rhythmic, his voice with the rhythm in his voice, but then kind of the repetition of the lyrics or like the tempo too.
Yep. Yeah, there's no long songs like the original album, right? There's bits and pieces of this in the first, but mixed in with that jazz fusion approach. Like I think We Will Fail is the song that immediately comes to mind, right? And No Fun even's a freeform one, and then there's not the traditional riffs, on that one. It's just it's
Funhouse was more of a of the free jazz, right? Not
free
No Fun.
Jazz. No Fun was more like long form, but it wasn't like free jazz. Funhouse was more the free. I apologize.
Right.
I mixed those two up, but
it's like I just piggyback off what you say, John. It's crazy that this was there, and it's something that it's one of those bands that I think that I had always maybe heard of, but really knew nothing about. And I think that they are definitely, even though with all those artists that you had mentioned about how much that they, were influenced by them or how much they love this album, this I think this is a criminally underrated band. With either radio play, popularity, mass popularity, people talking about it, just kind of being in the normal lexicon as you're discussing music history. This is a band that I think should get more due, because all that stuff that you said, this is like, it's much more of a modern rock and roll, taking that blues but just making it's heavy, fast, energetic, and just paving the way for all the stuff that came afterwards.
You can't have listened to anything good in the 70s, 80s, or early 90s without hearing elements of this in it.
Yeah.
You really can't. Like, it's basically, it informs so many of the mass culture of rock, almost as much as anybody. The MC5, sound was here, but they took it and just sexied it up and sludged it up and went different directions. And you can see why Bowie was fascinated with this band too, can't you? Because they I think he just got the danger and the energy from it. And they weren't even playing personas, right? Like Iggy Pop was he was himself, right? But he was a freaking persona, just like Ziggy Stardust was, just as Iggy, right? So
Well, I had to look this up because I was like, they're probably not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but no, they actually are. They were inducted in 2010, so I was like, okay, they got that right.
Yeah, and it's such an interesting counterpoint listening to this and then listening to Led Zeppelin 4, or vice versa. An album
which also
came
ushered
out
in
before this one, this album,
right? Which is insane. But it also, that was another album that was ushered in a sound for the next 20 years. You know what I mean? So you have two that. The Stooges and Led Zeppelin probably were as influential as any bands in the early 70s to like music the next 20 years that existed, right? In this period, the early 70s. There's more bands that tried to sound like Led Zeppelin and tried to sound like the Stooges than probably almost any other two acts, right?
Yeah, definitely.
I think.
You want to throw up Sabbath in there?
Yeah, maybe with throw Sabbath in. Yeah, that's.
Metal never got as popular maybe as punk or hard rock, but
it certainly did. But
it's as popular. There's a ton of metal bands. There's still a ton of metal. That's a very niche, passionate fan base.
Metal is one of those things that people don't realize how many metal albums get sold in concert tickets, because they have their own charts kind of. But if you look at the last 20, 25 years and you look at album sales and downloads and stuff, metal is basically propping up rock in this day and age. But that's a conversation, as we get to the late 70s and early 80s, when we're going to be covering, early Metallica albums and Slayer and, Iron Maiden and Priest and stuff, we'll be able to have that conversation down. But you're right, Matt. I'd put Sabbath in there too. So Zeppelin, Sabbath, and the Stooges. I would say for early 70s bands that they're probably the three that have the biggest footprint of what would come the next 20, 25 years.